I'm Arthur. On the maps, it is barely there at all. A little wedge of mainland on the west coast of Africa, and a single green island out in the Gulf of Guinea, together about the size of one small American state. Fewer people lived in the whole of it than live in a mid-sized city. And on the day it became its own country, it was, by some measures, one of the richest places in Africa, with good roads, full hospitals, and cocoa plantations that fed the chocolate of Europe. 11 years later, the world had given it a different name. People who knew what had happened there had started calling it the Auschwitz of Africa. A third of its people were gone, murdered or driven across the borders into exile. The schools were shut, the churches were padlocked. The boats had been smashed so no one could escape by sea, and the man who had done all of it was the same man they had elected on that hopeful first morning, a man who had since declared himself a living God, and who now sat alone in a jungle house, talking, his servants said, to the dead. What has held on to me about this story is not only the horror of it, though the horror is real, it is how completely the world managed to look away. A nation was nearly emptied out, in plain sight, in our own lifetimes, and most of us were never told its name even once. Tonight, I want to give it back its name and tell it properly, end to end, the way you tell a hard story to someone you trust. How a prosperous little country elected its own destroyer, what he did to it across 11 years, and how it ended, in a courtyard, in front of a firing squad that had to be brought in from another country because his own people were too afraid to pull the trigger. So find a quiet place and let the room go still. This is a small story and a very large one, and it has waited a long time to be heard. Start with the size of it, because the size is the thing that makes the rest almost impossible to hold in your head. The country is called Equatorial Guinea. It sits on the equator, on the western coast of Central Africa, and it is made of two very different pieces. There is the mainland, a rectangle of dense rainforest called Rio Muni, wedged between Cameroon to the north and Gabon to the south and east. And then, a short distance out into the warm waters of the Gulf of Guinea, there is an island, lush and volcanic and astonishingly fertile, that was once called Fernando Po and is today called Bioko. Put the two pieces together and you have a country smaller than many a single province. At the time this story begins, in the late 1960s, perhaps 300,000 people lived in all of it. That is the entire population, not of a city within the country, the whole nation. You could have fit every living citizen of Equatorial Guinea into a single large football stadium several times over, and had room to spare. And I want you to hold that image of a stadium, because before this story is over, a stadium is exactly where the worst of it will happen. For its size, this little place had something most of its neighbors did not. It had money. The volcanic soil of the island grew some of the finest cocoa in the world, and for decades that cocoa had made fortunes. By one accounting, in the years just before independence, the territory had the highest export earnings per person of anywhere in Africa. As far back as 1960, the value of what the colony sold abroad ran past $30 million in the money of the day, an extraordinary figure for a place so small. There were paved roads and a functioning port and clinics and a literacy rate that outstripped much of the continent. On paper, this was one of the most promising small countries in the developing world. It had every reason to expect a gentle future. What it got instead was 11 years that historians now place among the darkest any modern nation has endured. The numbers are disputed, and we will be honest about that disputation when we reach it, because the not knowing is part of the wound. But even the most cautious estimates describe a catastrophe. Tens of thousands of people killed, out of a population of barely 300,000. Some careful estimates run as low as 5,000. Others run to 50, 60, 80,000. More than 100,000 others fled across the borders, abandoning their homes, their land, their dead. By the end, by some counts, only a third of the people who had greeted independence were still inside the country at all. The rest were in graves, or in exile, or simply gone in the way that people went in those years, walking out one morning and never arriving anywhere that kept a record. And here is something I find almost as hard to absorb as the suffering itself. While it was happening, the world had the information. This was not a sealed kingdom in a forgotten century. There were embassies and exiles giving testimony, and human rights organizations raising the alarm, and reports reaching the capitals of Europe. The killing was documented in real time by people who begged the wider world to care. And the wider world, busy with the Cold War and the larger crises of larger places, mostly filed it away. A country can be destroyed in full view, it turns out, if it is small enough and far enough away and poor enough in the things that great powers want. That is part of what I mean when I say I want to give this story back its name. The forgetting was not an accident of time. It began while the graves were still being dug. Here is the question that has held me and that I want us to sit with for the whole of tonight. How does that happen? Not in a great power with armies and ideologies and the machinery of an industrial state. How does it happen in a place this small, this rich, this full of promise? How does a country that had every advantage hand itself willingly at the ballot box to the man who would do this to it? And once it had, why did the world, which was watching plenty of other things in those years, manage so thoroughly not to watch this? The answer begins, as these answers so often do, not with a monster, but with an ordinary and damaged man, a minor colonial official who had failed more often than he had succeeded, who carried a wound from his own childhood that he never named and never healed, and who rode the great hopeful wave of African independence into a power that no one, least of all him, was ready for him to hold. To understand what he became, you have to understand the world that made him. And to understand that, we have to go back, before the man, to the island and its cocoa, and to the strange, unequal little colony that Spain built and then, almost carelessly, let go. The story of how Spain came to own a piece of Africa is, like a great deal of colonial history, a story of paperwork and indifference. In the year 1778, in a treaty signed at El Pardo, Portugal handed Spain a claim to the island of Fernando Po and a stretch of the African coast in exchange for territory elsewhere in the world. For a long while, Spain did very little with it. The island was difficult, the climate was punishing to Europeans, and for decades the Spanish presence was thin to the point of invisibility. For much of the 19th century it was the British, not the Spanish, who made the most use of the island, running an anti-slavery naval base out of its harbor, a detail worth holding on to, because the same shoreline that once launched ships to free the enslaved would one day hold the prison where a free country tortured its own. What changed everything was a plant, the cacao tree, brought across the Atlantic, found in the volcanic soil of Fernando Po, something close to paradise. By the late 1800s and into the 1900s, the island had become one great plantation, its hillsides terraced with cocoa, its harvests shipped to Europe to be turned into chocolate. The money that came back was real, and it built the things that money builds. A town grew up around the harbor, called Santa Isabel, with Spanish colonial architecture and a cathedral and the comfortable houses of the planters. But here is the thing to understand about that prosperity, because it is the crack that everything else would later pour through. The wealth was real, and it was almost entirely not for the native Africans. The plantations were owned by Spaniards and by a small class of established island families, some of them descended from freed slaves and settlers who had become planters in their own right, a Creole elite. The hard labor that grew the cocoa was done, increasingly, by workers brought in from elsewhere, many of them from Nigeria, tens of thousands of contract laborers who crossed the water to work the harvests for wages that the planters set, under conditions that the planters controlled. The native peoples of the territory lived at the edges of this economy, not at its heart. It is worth sitting with that arrangement for a moment, because it built a habit of mind that would outlast the Spanish. This was a place where the wealth was produced by one group of people, owned by another, and guarded by a third, and where the men at the top had decided, as a matter of policy, that the people at the bottom should be kept simple, unlettered, and replaceable. Power here had never meant service. It had always meant extraction, the taking of value out of land and labor for the benefit of whoever held the whip. When independence came, and a new man took hold of that whip, the deepest structures did not change as fast as the flag did. The plantation logic, that a country is a thing to be squeezed by the powerful rather than built for the many, was already in the soil. Macías did not invent the idea that the people of this place existed to be used. He inherited it, and then he took it somewhere the Spanish, for all their contempt, had never dreamed of going. And there were two main native peoples, and the difference between them matters for the whole of this story. On the island lived the Bubi, a people who had been there long before the Spanish came, descended from Bantu migrants who had crossed from the mainland in the deep past, farmers and fishers and traders with their own language and their own kings. The Bubi had long resisted being pulled onto the plantations, resisted having their land taken and their labor demanded, and they paid for that resistance over the generations. On the mainland, in the rainforest of Rio Muni, lived the Fang, a larger and far more numerous people who had moved into the region over generations and who would, by sheer weight of numbers, come to dominate the politics of the country. The island was Bubi, the mainland was Fang. Spain governed them together as one colony, but they were not one people, and the resentments between them, the island's older wealth against the mainland's newer numbers, would be a fault line that a clever and cruel man could one day pry wide open. When, at the very end of this story, a court charges that man with genocide, it is the Bubi of this island they will mean. Spain ruled all of this with a particular kind of contempt. The scholars who have studied the Spanish colonial mind in this period describe an attitude that held black Africans to be, in the words one historian recovered, among the lowest of peoples, too unknown and too distant and too alien to be taken seriously as equals. Spain built schools, yes, and a relatively high number of its colonial subjects learned to read and write, higher than in much of black Africa, but it built almost nothing above that floor. It did not want African doctors or African lawyers or African engineers. By the time independence came, in a population of hundreds of thousands, the number of university-educated professionals could be counted very nearly on your fingers. The colony had been kept deliberately simple. It had laborers and clerks and interpreters, and above them Spaniards, and very little in between. This is the inheritance, a tiny, rich, unequal place, an island of cocoa money and a mainland of forest and numbers. Two peoples who did not love each other, held together by a third that looked down on them both. A literate population with almost no leaders, because leadership was the one thing the colony had been careful never to grow. When Spain, under pressure from a changing world and a watchful United Nations, finally decided in the 1960s to let this colony go. It was handing independence to a country that had been built, with some care, to be unready for it. Into that unreadiness stepped the men who wanted to lead, and the strangest and most damaged of them had come. Like the cocoa itself was foreign to the mainland, from far inland, from a forest village near the border, carrying a history that would have broken most people, and that had, perhaps, already broken him. He was born on the first day of January, in the year 1924, in a small village in the deep forest of Rio Muni, near the town of Mongamo, close to the border with Gabon. He was Fang, of a clan called the Esangui, a detail that matters more than it might seem, because that clan, his clan, from that corner of the mainland forest, would become one of the 3 pillars on which he built his rule. The name his family gave him would later be changed, and changed again as he reinvented himself, but the world would come to know him as Francisco Macías Nguema. The accounts of his childhood come down to us through a mix of his biographers and Fang oral tradition, and they are difficult, and they should be held as what they are, the difficult and sometimes uncertain stories that gather around a man who later became infamous. But they are striking enough and consistent enough that they are worth telling with care. By these accounts, his father was a man of some standing in the traditional religion of the region, a healer or a sorcerer in the old Fang practices, and not a gentle figure. There is a story, told and retold, that one of Macías's own brothers died at their father's hand, sacrificed, in the dark logic of a tradition that was said to demand human remains for the gaining of power. Whether that is literal truth, or the kind of terrible legend that attaches itself to such a man afterward, no one can now say for certain, but it sat at the root of him. What is told more consistently, and is more often repeated by those who have studied his life, is what happened when he was a boy of about 9 years old. His father, by these accounts, went to a local colonial administrator to argue, as a man of standing among his people, for better treatment and better wages, and the administrator beat him to death for it. A man killed in front of, or near to, his young son, for the offense of asking. And within about a week of that, the accounts say, the boy's mother took her own life. A child of 9, left with a crowd of siblings and no parents, in a colonial world that had just shown him, in the most direct way imaginable, exactly what a black African's life was worth to the men who governed it. I want to be careful here, the way I always try to be careful with the childhoods of people who go on to do monstrous things. A hard childhood is not an excuse, and the great majority of people who suffer terribly as children grow up to harm no one. The orphan of Mongamo is not owed our sympathy for what he became, but if we want to understand him, and understanding is not the same as forgiving, then we cannot skip the wound, because the man who emerged from that childhood carried 2 things into his adult life that would, decades later, reshape a nation. He carried a bottomless hatred and fear of educated, powerful outsiders, the kind of men who had killed his father, and he carried, underneath it, a sense of his own inferiority so deep that no amount of power would ever fill it. He was not a clever student, or at least not a successful one. He tried, the records suggest, 3 times to pass the colonial civil service examination, and 3 times he failed, succeeding only on a 4th attempt. Sit with that for a moment, because it tells you something. A proud, wounded man, in a system that measured worth by Spanish credentials he could barely obtain, scraping past the bar on his 4th try, and never, one suspects, forgetting how close he had come to not passing at all. The educated men around him, the ones with the easy diplomas and the fluent Spanish, would always be, to him, both objects of envy and targets of suspicion. But he was patient, and he was shrewd in the way that wounded men can be shrewd, and he climbed. He worked as an interpreter in the colonial courts, translating between the Spanish administrators and the African subjects, which gave him a front-row seat to how power actually worked, who held it, who feared it, and how a careful man might position himself in its shadow. He served as the mayor of his hometown. He held a post overseeing public works. And as Spain began, slowly, to grant the colony a measure of self-government in the 1960s, he rose into it, becoming a deputy prime minister in the autonomous government that was meant to be a bridge to independence. There is a bitter irony folded into that rise, and it is worth pausing on, because it is the engine of everything that followed. Every rung Macías climbed, he climbed inside the Spanish system. He learned its laws as a court interpreter. He administered its towns. He took its salary, wore its responsibilities, owed his whole career to the colonial machine he privately despised. The man who would one day order his country to erase every Spanish name and burn every Spanish book was himself, in every practical sense, a product of Spanish rule, shaped by it, elevated by it, and ashamed of it. The historians who have studied him reach often for the language of the wounded ego, the way a deep sense of inferiority can curdle into a need to dominate. He had been taught, by a colonial world, that he was less, and he had decided, somewhere in that forest childhood, that he would one day be more than anyone, not equal, more. The trouble with building a life on a wound like that is that no amount of power ever closes it. There is always one more person who might be looking down on you, one more educated man whose mere existence feels like an insult, one more rival to be removed. A man like that, handed a whole country, does not stop. He cannot. The wound will not let him. By the time the colony was ready to choose its first president, Francisco Macías Nguema, the failed examinee, the orphan of the forest, was one of the men in the running, and he had learned, somewhere along the way, the one political skill that mattered most in that moment. He had learned how to speak to the anger of ordinary people against the foreigners who had ruled them. When he spoke against Spain, against the planters, against the educated few who had grown comfortable under colonial rule, he was not performing. He meant it from the bottom of that 9-year-old's grief. And a man who means his anger is far more persuasive than a man who merely uses it. It was the truest thing in him, and it would carry him all the way to the top. By the middle of the 1960s, the age of European empires in Africa was ending. Country by country, year by year. The winds had shifted. The newly independent nations of the continent were taking their seats at the United Nations, and that body was pressing the remaining colonial powers hard to finish the work of decolonization. Spain, which had never invested much pride in this small and difficult colony, decided it was time to let go. In the spring of 1968, Madrid announced that Equatorial Guinea would become independent. A constitution was drawn up, with Spanish guidance and United Nations oversight, a careful document meant to balance the island and the mainland, to protect the rights of minorities, to build a real democracy. In August of that year it was put to the people in a referendum, and they approved it, by a margin of around 63%. It is worth saying clearly what that constitution tried to be, because the gap between the document and what came next is its own kind of tragedy. It was a thoughtful thing, drawn up with outside help, designed for a fragile new country with two peoples who did not fully trust each other. It tried to balance the island and the mainland. It promised rights and courts and elections and the ordinary protections that are supposed to stand between a citizen and the power of the state. On paper, Equatorial Guinea was born a constitutional democracy with all the proper furniture of one. The problem is that a constitution is only as strong as the institutions and the people willing to defend it. And this was a country that had been deliberately built without either. There were almost no independent judges, because Spain had trained almost none. There was no tradition of one government peacefully handing power to another, because there had never been a government to hand it. There was no free press to speak of, no civil service loyal to the law rather than to a man. The furniture of democracy was all there, freshly delivered, standing in a house that had no foundation under it. It would take one determined man very little time to push the whole thing over. Then came the part that mattered most, an election, the first and, as it would turn out, very nearly the last truly free election the country would ever hold, to choose the man who would lead it into independence. There were 4 main candidates, and they represented the different faces of the small educated class that Spain had so carefully kept small. There was Bonifacio Ondo Edu, who had led the autonomous government as its prime minister, an establishment figure, seen by many as the favorite and as the candidate most acceptable to Spain. There was Atanasio Ndongo Mione, a nationalist with a long history in the independence movement and ties to the wider world of African liberation politics. There was Edmundo Bocio, a Bubi leader from the island, the voice of that older island, people. And there was Francisco Macías Nguema, the deputy prime minister from Mongomo, who ran as the outsider, the man of the people, the candidate who spoke hardest and angriest against the lingering hand of Spain. The first round of voting was held on the 22nd of September, 1968. When the results came in, no one had a majority. Macías led the field, but only just, with about 36,700 votes, a little over 40%. Ondo Edu came second, with nearly 32,000. Ndongo took around 18,000, and Bocio a few thousand more. Because no candidate had crossed the halfway line, the contest went to a runoff between the 2 leaders, Macías and Ondo Edu, 1 week later. And here the shape of the future revealed itself, though no one could have read it clearly at the time. In the days between the 2 rounds, the candidates who had lost made their choices about whom to back, and Ndongo and Bocio, the nationalist and the Bubi leader, threw their support behind Macías. It was, in the cold arithmetic of elections, the sensible move, the populist outsider against the establishment man. In the runoff, with their voters added to his, Macías won decisively, taking around 68,000 votes to Ondo Edu's 40,000. On the 3rd of October, 1968, Francisco Macías Nguema was declared the first president-elect of Equatorial Guinea. I want you to hold the names of the 2 men who put him over the top, Ndongo and Bocio, because their choice in those days is one of the quiet tragedies inside this larger one. They were kingmakers. They looked at the field and decided that this angry outsider was the future, and they lent him their voters, and they made him president. Within a few short years, both of them would be dead, killed by the very man they had raised up. The nationalist would go first, within months. The Bubi leader would last a little longer, would even be made vice president before he too was taken to a prison by the sea. The men who made the king did not survive the kingdom. 9 days after the result, on the 12th of October, 1968, the Spanish flag came down for the last time over Santa Isabel, and the flag of the new nation went up. There were ceremonies and speeches and the ordinary, fragile hope that attends the birth of any country. Equatorial Guinea was free and rich and small, and it had chosen its leader at the ballot box fairly, the way a democracy is supposed to. If you had stood in that crowd on that morning, you would have had every reason to believe you were watching the beginning of something good. What you were actually watching was a trap closing, very slowly, in a way that no one in the crowd could yet see, and it would take only a few months and a quarrel over a flag for the trap to spring. For a few months, the new country held its shape. Then, in the late winter of 1969, it began to come apart, and the thing that pulled the first thread loose was, of all things, a flag. Relations between the new president and the former colonial power had been tense from the start, because tension with Spain was the very thing Macías had been elected on. He needed Spain to be the enemy, because anti-colonial fury was the engine of his power, and an engine has to be fed. In February of 1969, he found his incident. There were still Spanish officials and a Spanish presence in the country, and at Bata, the main town on the mainland, Spanish flags were flying over official buildings. Macías decided, or chose to decide, that there were too many of them, that one Spanish flag too many had been raised on what was now sovereign soil. He sent his personal guard to haul one of them down. It was a small thing, and it was meant to be, but it was the spark to a fire that had been laid for months. When the Spanish ambassador came to discuss the matter, Macías threw him out of his office and cabled Madrid, demanding the man be recalled. Across the country, the temperature rose. There were anti-Spanish speeches, and Macías toured the territory, delivering tirades against the foreigners he said were still trying to strangle the young nation. Spaniards living in the country grew frightened, and then they began to leave, in numbers, in a hurry, and as they left they took with them the one thing the country could least afford to lose. They took the running of it, the planters, the engineers, the doctors, the administrators who actually kept the machinery turning, packed what they could and sailed away. In a matter of weeks, a country that had depended on Spanish expertise for everything found that expertise gone. The man who had built his career on the enemy of Spain had now driven Spain out and was discovering, perhaps, how much he had liked having an enemy and how little he knew about running the thing the enemy had left behind. And then, in the first days of March, in the heat of that crisis, came the event that would change the country forever. The foreign minister, Atanasio Ndongo Mione, the nationalist who had thrown his support behind Macías in the runoff and helped make him president, attempted, or was said to have attempted, a coup. The exact truth of what happened in those days has never been fully settled, and that uncertainty is itself important because it became the model for everything that followed. By the official account, Ndongo and others moved against the president while Macías was away delivering one of his anti-Spanish speeches, and the coup was put down. By the account that many historians now find more persuasive, the plot was thin, or exaggerated, or in part manufactured, a crisis that Macías either provoked or seized upon, because it handed him exactly what he needed: a reason to declare an emergency, a reason to arrest his rivals, a reason to begin the killing. What is not in dispute is what happened to the men. Atanasio Ndongo, the foreign minister, was taken. The official story said that he tried to take his own life by jumping from a window at the presidential palace. Almost no one believed it then, and almost no one believes it now. It is widely held that he was thrown. Whatever the truth of the fall, he was denied medical care for his injuries, and he died of them on the 26th of March, 1969. He was 41 years old. The first of the two kingmakers was gone, within 5 months of the election he had helped to win, and Bonifacio Ondo Edu, the establishment leader, the man Macías had beaten in the runoff, met an end just as dark. After losing the election, he had fled across the border to Gabon, afraid, correctly, of what was coming. Macías demanded that Gabon hand him back, and Gabon refused. But the Spanish, in the confusion of those weeks, returned him to Equatorial Guinea themselves, delivering him into the hands of the man who most wanted him dead. He was taken to a prison in the capital, a place on the black volcanic sand of the shoreline that the world would come to know by its name, Black Beach. And there, in early March of 1969, Bonifacio Ondo Edu died. The official word, again, was suicide. The reality, by the accounts that survive, was torture and murder. In the space of a single month, the men who had stood against Macías, or beside him, and then fallen under suspicion, were destroyed. The opposition, such as it was, had been decapitated, and Macías had learned the lesson that would define his rule. A crisis, real or invented, was a tool. Fear was a tool, and the men most dangerous to him were not peasants in the forest, but the educated, the credentialed, the capable, the very people who might one day replace him. He had spent his childhood watching such a man kill his father. He had spent his adulthood failing to become one of them. Now he would spend his presidency hunting them down. The flag had come down at Bata. The country was about to go dark. Power, once a frightened man, begins to gather it, tends to gather quickly, because each new grasp removes one more thing that might have stopped the next. Across the years from 1970 to 1972, Francisco Macías Nguema took a presidency that had been won at the ballot box and turned it, step by careful step, into something the modern world had rarely seen. First came the party. In 1970, the other political movements of the country were dissolved and folded into a single ruling party, which would come to be known by its initials in Spanish as the PUNT, the United National Workers' Party. There would be no other party now. To be political at all was to be of his party, or to be an enemy. Then came the laws that made him untouchable. A decree handed him direct power over every organ of the state and every institution of the country. Another made it a capital crime, punishable by death, so much as to threaten or insult the president. And then, in July of 1972, the keystone was set in place. Francisco Macías Nguema declared himself president for life. The election was over, permanently. There would never be another. He would rule until he died, and he intended to rule for a very long time. His power rested, in the end, on three pillars, and it is worth naming all three, because together they explain how so few could hold down so many. There was the party, the PUNT, which made all politics his. There was his clan, the Asangi of Mongomo, his own people from his own corner of the forest, whom he placed in the positions that mattered, so that the state and the family began to blur into one another. And there was the third pillar, the one that did the frightening work, a youth militia. We will come to what it did. For now, understand that the country was held in a grip with three fingers, party, clan, and militia, and the hand that closed them belonged to a single wounded man. But raw power was not enough for him, and here the story turns from the merely brutal to the genuinely strange, because Macías did not only want to control the country, he wanted to become it. He began to assign himself titles, each one larger and more unhinged than the last. He was the unique miracle. He was the Grand Master of Education, Science, and Culture, a title of breathtaking irony from a man who was in the process of destroying all three. He was the sole guide of his people, the one source from which the nation was said to flow, and the slogans that were posted across the country that school children were made to chant did not stop at praise. They reached for the divine. "There is no other God than Macías Nguema," read one. God created Equatorial Guinea thanks to Macías, read another. Without Macías, there would be no Equatorial Guinea. Think about what is being claimed there, because it is not the ordinary boastfulness of dictators. It is a man placing himself above God and ordering a Christian country, which Equatorial Guinea largely was, to agree. The churches, which we will come to, were eventually ordered to thank the president before they were permitted to thank their God, and then were ordered to thank only the president, and then were closed altogether. The slogan was the program. He was not to be a leader of the nation, he was to be its deity, its creator, the source from which it flowed. And to question that, even silently, even in your face, was to risk your life. He reached even into the names of things. Santa Isabel, the colonial capital with its cathedral and its harbor, he renamed Malabo. The island of Fernando Po, the Cocoa Island, he renamed after himself, after a version of his own name. The island of Annobon he renamed as well. He gave the people new names too, eventually demanding that they shed the Spanish, Christian names of the colonial era and take African ones, beginning with himself, refashioning his own name into a longer, older, more authentic-sounding string of syllables. There is a logic to all of it if you follow the wound back far enough. The man who had been made to feel small by the Spanish, the man who had failed their examinations and resented their educated sons, was now erasing them. Their flag, their names, their church, their language, their professionals, all of it scrubbed away, and his own face and name painted over the top, and all of it had to be performed daily by everyone. This is the part that is easy to underestimate from a comfortable distance, the sheer labor of living inside a personality cult. You did not merely have to obey Macías, you had to be seen to adore him. There were the slogans to chant, and the portraits to display, and the rallies to attend, with the militia watching to see whose enthusiasm seemed thin. A torn or faded portrait of the president in your home could be read as an act of treason, as one of his own vice presidents would learn at the cost of his life. So people kept the pictures clean and the praise loud, not because they believed a word of it, but because the performance was the price of staying alive. A whole nation went through the motions of worshiping a man it had every reason to fear and hate, and each forced chant made the next one feel a little more normal, until the lie was simply the air that everyone breathed. That is how a cult of personality actually works. Not by convincing people, but by exhausting them into compliance, until going along is easier than the unthinkable risk of stopping. It would be a kind of dark comedy, this collection of titles and slogans, if it were not the public face of a private machine that was, in those same years, killing people by the thousand. The unique miracle was not a joke to the people who lived under him. It was the name of the thing that could have you taken away in the night for owning a Spanish book, or wearing the wrong expression, or being simply too educated, too capable, too much like the men he had always feared. The cult was the velvet over the iron. These long, quiet histories are the kind of thing you like to keep company with on a dark evening. This is the channel that makes them, and you are always welcome to follow along. Now, back to the country he was remaking, and to the war he declared next, which was not a war on a person or a party at all. It was a war on the simple act of knowing things. Of all the things Francisco Macías did to his country, the one that historians return to most often, the one that gives his regime its particular and chilling character, is this: he made a deliberate, sustained, and remarkably thorough war on knowledge itself, not on a rival ideology, not on a foreign power, but on the simple human act of knowing things. And he won that war so completely that one researcher who studied the regime described its core policy as a deliberate cultural regression, a society pushed backward, on purpose, toward a darkness it had already climbed out of. It started with the word. Macías ordered that the very word intellectual be banished from public life, treated as a slur, a marker of the enemy. To be called an intellectual was to be accused, and the accusation was lethal, because the man at the top of the country had spent his whole life believing that educated people were the ones who killed fathers and looked down on the failed and the wounded. Now he had the power to act on that belief without limit, and he did. The educated class of Equatorial Guinea, the doctors and the teachers and the civil servants and the few professionals that Spain had grudgingly allowed to exist, were hunted, driven into exile, or killed. By the end, by various accounts, something close to the entire educated population of the country was gone, dead or fled. A nation was, quite deliberately, beheaded of its own mind. Try to picture what that means at the level of an ordinary life, because the phrase "the educated class" can stay abstract until you make it concrete. It means that when your child falls sick, there may be no doctor within reach, because the doctors are dead or across the border. It means that when you need a document, a permit, a record of your own land, there may be no one left who knows how to keep one. It means the engineer who understood the water system has fled, and so the water system fails, and no one who remains knows how to mend it. A modern country is held up, invisibly, by a few thousand people who know how to do specific difficult things, and when you remove them deliberately, all at once, the country does not simply lose its elite, it loses its competence. The lights, in a sense, go out, not because anyone smashed the bulbs, but because everyone who understood the wiring is gone. Macías did not only kill people, he unmade the accumulated knowledge of a society, the slow inheritance of skill that takes generations to build and a single paranoid decade to burn down. And it did not stop with the people who already knew things. It reached for the children to make sure they never would. In 1975, private education was declared subversive and effectively banned. The schools, which under the Spanish had given this small country one of the better literacy rates on the continent, were allowed to decay and close. To teach became dangerous, to learn became pointless and even risky. A generation of children grew up in a country where the act of educating them had been classified as a threat to the state. The Grand Master of Education, Science, and Culture had presided over the shuttering of the schools and felt, as far as anyone could tell, no contradiction in it at all. There are stories from these years that have the quality of grotesque legend, and I want to handle them honestly, because some of them are better attested than others. It is widely reported, for instance, that to wear eyeglasses became dangerous because glasses marked you as a reader, an educated person, a potential intellectual, and that this association could cost a person their life. Whether that was formal policy or the kind of terrible folk truth that grows up in a society where everyone is guessing at what will get them killed, the effect was the same. People learned to hide what they knew. They learned to seem simpler, smaller, less lettered than they were, because intelligence had become a thing that drew the eye of the state, and the eye of that state was death. Imagine a whole country quietly playing dumb to survive. Imagine teaching your own child to hide the fact that they can read. That is what it is to live inside a war on knowing. What makes this the heart of the story, to me, is that it was not an accident or a side effect. Many dictatorships kill their opponents. Macías did something more particular. He attacked the country's capacity to ever understand or oppose him by destroying the educated people who might lead, the schools that might produce more of them, and the very idea that knowing things was good. He was building a country that could not think its way out of him. And for a while, it worked. The professionals fled, the teachers stopped teaching, the clever learned to play dumb, and into the silence where a country's mind had been, Macías poured his slogans, and his titles, and his fear. A society can survive the loss of a great deal. It can rebuild roads, and replant fields, and reopen ports. What it cannot easily rebuild, what takes generations to grow back once it has been cut down, is its educated class, its institutional memory, its doctors and engineers and teachers, the slow human infrastructure of competence. Macías understood that, in his wounded and cunning way, better than almost any tyrant of his century. He went for the mind first, and the country has, in some real sense, never fully recovered it. But the war on knowing was the quiet part of the horror, the part you had to understand to see. The loud part, the part that earned the country its terrible nickname, was happening at the same time, in the prisons and the camps, and, on one infamous night, in a football stadium lit up for the occasion. To rule a country by fear, the fear has to be fed. It has to be made visible, regularly, theatrically, so that no one is ever quite able to forget what the state is capable of. Francisco Macías understood this, and he built, across his 11 years, a machinery of terror that reached into every village on the mainland and every town on the island. And the most active part of that machinery, the part that did the day-to-day work of frightening a nation, was that third pillar I mentioned, the youth militia. It was called, in Spanish, the Juventud en Marcha con Macías, which means, roughly, the youth on the march with Macías. It was a young people's movement, loosely modeled, as such things were in that era, on the militant youth movements of other times and other tyrannies, the kind of organization that turns the energy and the cruelty of the young toward the worship of one man. Its members were often just volunteers in ordinary clothes, which made them more frightening, not less, because you could not tell them apart from anyone else until they came for you. They spread the propaganda, they enforced the worship, and they did a great deal of the regime's violence, manning the kangaroo courts that handed down sentences already decided, carrying out the beatings, filling the prisons. A country was being terrorized in large part by its own children, organized and pointed at their parents. At the center of it all was the prison, and the prison's name has become a kind of shorthand for the whole regime, Black Beach. It sat on the volcanic shoreline of the capital, and it was, by every account that has come out of it, a place of almost unimaginable suffering. Prisoners were starved, they were beaten, often with wooden clubs, which became a signature of the regime's executions, a way of killing that required no bullets and left the killers close enough to feel it. People were held without charge, without trial, without any of the machinery of law, because the machinery of law had been dismantled. The president was, in effect, the country's chief judge, and he handed down death the way other men sign letters. Whole families were imprisoned together, the spouses and children of suspects swept up alongside them, because in this system guilt was not personal, it was hereditary. It spread outward from the accused to everyone near them. To be related to an enemy was to be an enemy. It was at Black Beach that the second of the two kingmakers met his end. Edmundo Bosio, the booby leader who had backed Macías in 1968, had been rewarded for it, made the first vice president of the country. But a booby leader with a following of his own was exactly the kind of man this regime could not tolerate for long. In early 1974 he was stripped of his office, and in February of 1975, after an official portrait of Macías displayed at his home was found destroyed, he was arrested and taken to Black Beach, and there he died. The regime called it suicide, a barbiturate overdose. Almost no one believed it. The man who had helped lift Macías to power followed the man Macías had beaten into the same prison, into the same dark, over the matter of a damaged picture. The terror spread through forced labor too, and here the island's older wounds were reopened with new cruelty. The Bubi, who had resisted the plantations under the Spanish, were now driven onto them under their own government, conscripted into labor on the very cocoa estates their ancestors had refused. The persecution of the Bubi as a people, their politicians killed, their would-be leaders destroyed, their communities forced into labor and fear, is the specific crime that a court would one day name as genocide. And, across the whole country, people simply vanished. The phrase is worn smooth from overuse, but in Equatorial Guinea in these years it meant exactly what it says. A person would be there, and then a vehicle would come, and then they would not be there, and no one would ever again be able to say with certainty what had become of them. Over half the population, by some estimates, was arrested at least once during these years, or had a close relative killed. Let that figure settle. In a country of 300,000, more than half had been inside the machine, or had lost someone to it. Think about what it does to a society, to live like that, year after year. When more than half the people around you have been arrested, or have buried someone, or have watched a neighbor loaded into a vehicle and never returned, trust does not merely weaken, it dies. You cannot speak freely to your friends, because a friend who repeats the wrong sentence, even by accident, can end you. You cannot complain, you cannot question, you cannot even let your face show too much, because the militia wears ordinary clothes and could be anyone. Parents learn to be careful in front of their own children, because a child might repeat at school what was said at home, and the school, what was left of it, reported upward. A whole nation was taught to perform a contentment it did not feel, to chant the slogans of a God it did not believe in, and to watch everyone, all the time, including the people it loved. That is the deepest damage of a regime like this, deeper even than the body count. It poisons the connective tissue of a society, the simple human ability to trust the person standing next to you. And that, too, takes generations to heal. The single most infamous night of the whole regime came early, in the first Christmas after the killing began, on the 24th of December, 1969, in the National Stadium in the capital. Around 150 prisoners, men, accused of plotting against the president, many of them tied to that murky coup crisis earlier in the year, were brought out and executed. And here the detail that has fixed this event in memory, the detail that is genuinely and reliably reported, not the lurid embroidery that later attached to it, but the thing itself. As the executions were carried out, loudspeakers around the stadium played music, a pop song, a gentle, sentimental, hugely popular tune of that exact era, Mary Hopkins' recording of a song called "Those Were the Days," a wistful number about looking back fondly on a time now gone. I have thought about that detail more than almost any other in this story, and I want to be careful not to turn it into theater, because the people who died there were real, and their deaths were not a scene in a film, but the juxtaposition is its own kind of testimony. A nostalgic love song, the sort of thing playing on radios in living rooms all across the world that Christmas, piped over the speakers of a stadium while the new country's leader killed 150 of his own people. That is the texture of this regime. Not only cruelty, but a kind of pageantry of cruelty, the horror staged with a soundtrack in the National Stadium at Christmas. You did not have to be told what it meant. The whole country understood. This is what we do now. This is who we are now. The nickname came in these years, whispered first and then spoken more openly by the few outsiders who knew what was happening. Some called it the Dachau of Africa. Some called it the Auschwitz of Africa, the title of this very film, reaching in their horror for the only comparison terrible enough to fit. It is a heavy comparison, and I do not make it lightly, and the scholars who study atrocity are right to insist on precision about such things, but you can understand why people reached for it. Here was a small country that had been turned end to end into an instrument for the killing and breaking of its own people, ruled by a man who had made himself a god, who killed by the thousand, who had emptied the schools and the churches and was, by the late 1970s, in the process of emptying the country itself. The comparison was not careful, but it was not, in the gut, wrong. And the part of the catastrophe that the nickname pointed at, the sheer hollowing out of an entire nation, was already well underway. The country is not only its people and its fear, it is also its economy, the daily machinery by which food is grown and goods are made and money moves, and one of the clearest ways to measure what Macías did to Equatorial Guinea is to watch that machinery seize and rust and stop. Remember where it started. At independence this had been, for its size, a wealthy place, and the engine of that wealth was the cocoa of the island. In the year of independence, cocoa is estimated to have made up around 3/4 of the entire economy. It was the country's gold, and growing it depended on two things Macías would manage, between them, to destroy. It depended on skill, the planters and managers and agronomists who knew how to run a plantation, and it depended on labor, the tens of thousands of contract workers, most of them Nigerian, who actually did the back-breaking work of the harvest. The skill went first, fleeing with the educated class and the departing Spanish in those early years. And then, in 1976, the labor went too, in a single dramatic exodus. The Nigerian workers on the island had been subjected to conditions so brutal, so violent, that the government of Nigeria finally intervened to rescue its own citizens. In early 1976, Nigeria evacuated its contract laborers from the island, tens of thousands of them, by some accounts around 45,000 people, citing the brutal ill treatment they had suffered. In a matter of weeks, the workforce that grew the cocoa simply sailed away, and the cocoa economy, the 3/4 of everything, collapsed. Within about a decade of independence, cocoa production had fallen to something like 1/7 of what it had been. The gold of the island had turned very nearly to nothing. The numbers that describe the wider collapse are difficult to verify precisely, as such numbers always are in a country that had abolished its own statistics, but the estimates that survive are staggering. By one widely cited figure, the income of an average person in Equatorial Guinea fell from somewhere around $1,400 a year at independence to about $70 a year by the middle of the 1970s, from $1,400 to $70. The country printed a new currency of its own, the equily, and it lost its value almost as fast as it was issued. There was no real budget, no functioning accounting, no development plan. The president had reportedly had the head of the central bank killed and had carried the national treasury, the actual cash, away to his compound in his home village of Mongamo, where it sat, by the accounts that survive, in his personal keeping, the wealth of a nation reduced to suitcases in a forest house. By the end, only the president, the army, and the police were reliably paid at all. Everyone else fell back toward subsistence, toward barter, toward growing what they could eat and trading the rest, a modern country sliding backward into the economy of a century before. And remember what an economy actually is, underneath the figures. It is whether there is medicine in the clinic. It is whether the harvest reaches a market before it rots. It is whether a parent can feed a child through a bad season. When the income of an average person falls from $1,400 to $70, that is not a line on a chart. That is hunger in homes that a decade earlier had been comfortable. That is a sick child and no doctor and no medicine and no money and no way out in a country that had recently had some of the best health care on the continent. The cocoa that had fed the chocolate of Europe rotted on the branch. The clinics emptied. The shops had little to sell and fewer who could pay for it. A nation that had been climbing slid backward, year by year, into a poverty it had already escaped once, and the man responsible sat in a forest house with the country's cash in suitcases beside him and let it happen. To keep himself afloat, Macías turned, as small and isolated rulers often did in those Cold War years, to the powers of the Eastern Bloc. He brought in the Soviet Union and Cuba and North Korea and China, and he played them against one another with a certain low cunning, threatening to drop one patron unless another paid more. The Soviets sent military advisors and bodyguards and a quantity of equipment, small arms, a handful of armored vehicles, an aircraft that soon fell into disrepair, and patrol boats. In return, he granted them fishing rights in his waters, and in one telling exchange the Soviet Union is said to have paid him in several thousand tons of fish, much of it reported to be of very poor quality, even rotting. A nation that had been one of the richest in Africa was now being paid for its seas in spoiled fish. He even let the Soviets run weapons through his territory to the fighters in Angola's war. The foreign guards and the foreign guns helped keep him alive. They did nothing at all for the people in the villages, wandered, and he sealed the country shut. This is the detail that, for me, captures the suffocating completeness of it. Macías banned fishing. In a country with a long coastline and an island, a country where people had fished for as long as there had been people there, fishing was forbidden and the boats were destroyed. The reason was not economic. It was that boats could be used to escape, and Macías did not want his people to be able to leave by sea. So he smashed the fleet and forbade the water, and those foreign patrol boats helped him watch it. People who had fed themselves from the ocean for generations were cut off from it, and the coastline became a wall. But they left anyway, in the tens of thousands, on foot, through the forest, across the land borders into Cameroon and Gabon, carrying what they could and abandoning the rest. The exodus was enormous relative to the size of the country. By one set of figures, by 1978 more than 100,000 people had fled, close to half the remaining population. The American magazine Time, reporting near the end, suggested perhaps 150,000 had gone. 2/3 of the country's lawmakers were dead or gone. Most of its original government ministers had been killed or had vanished. The educated were gone, the workers were gone, the planters were gone, and now ordinary families were streaming out through the trees, leaving behind a country that was, in the most literal sense, emptying. The Auschwitz of Africa was becoming a ghost of itself, its plantations going to bush, its towns half deserted, its president withdrawing further and further from all of it into the forest of his birth, where the last and strangest chapter of his rule was about to play out. There is a pattern that the most extreme tyrants seem to follow toward the end, a kind of final folding inward, where the paranoia that built the regime turns at last on the regime itself, and the ruler, having run out of enemies to find outside, begins to find them within his own house. Macías reached that stage, and the place he reached it was where he had begun, Mongomo, the forest, home. From around the middle of the 1970s, Macías largely abandoned the capital. He stopped living in the presidential palace by the sea and withdrew to his compound in Mongomo, deep in the mainland forest, close to the Gabon border, close to the village where the orphan had been made. From there, by radio and by decree and by the comings and goings of frightened officials, he ruled what was left of his country, at a distance, an absent god in the trees. He had even brought the nation's money with him, so that the treasury and the tyrant sat together in the same forest house, far from the people both were supposed to serve. And the stories that came out of those final years, told by the people who served him and survived, describe a man disappearing into something past sanity. I will tell these soberly, because they have a way of tipping into a horror show if you let them, and the truth is grim enough, without performance. It was said that he kept relics of the dead, in keeping with the dark traditions he had been raised in, that he had gathered the skulls of enemies and believed they gave him power, the same belief, perhaps, that had cost his own brother his life in the story of his childhood. It was said that those who attended him heard him speaking, alone, to people who were not there, reciting the names of the dead, holding conversations across an empty room. Whether every one of these accounts is literally true cannot now be established, and some of them surely grew in the telling, but they cluster consistently around the same picture. A profoundly isolated man, sealed in a forest compound with the treasury of a nation and the ghosts of the people he had killed, making decisions, it was said, on the basis of dreams and night visions, ruling a country he could no longer bear to look at, haunted in the most literal sense by what he had done. I have told a number of these stories now, of men who climbed to absolute power and then came apart inside it, and there is a terrible sameness to how it ends. The paranoia that is useful on the way up, that helps a man see the knife before it falls, does not switch off once he reaches the top. It keeps running, with nothing left to restrain it, and no rival left to aim it at, and so it turns inward, and begins to consume the very circle that holds the ruler up. Macías had used suspicion as a tool for so long that, in the end, he could no longer tell a tool from a feeling. Everyone was a threat, because everyone always had been. The only difference now was that the threats he saw were his own ministers, his own guards, his own blood. A man cannot govern a country from inside a mind like that. He can only haunt it. And by that last year, that is what Macías had become, less a president than a kind of curse the country was quietly waiting to have lifted, and his war on God reached its end in these years. The slogans that had placed him above the divine were no longer enough. In 1978, he ordered the Catholic Church, the faith of the great majority of his people, effectively shut down. Churches were closed, worship was suppressed. Owning the objects of the faith, a crucifix, the wrong book, could become grounds for arrest. The man who had begun by ordering priests to thank him before they thanked God, ended by forbidding the thanking of God at all. There was to be one source of all things in Equatorial Guinea, and it was not in heaven. It sat in a house in the forest at Mongomo, talking to the dead. Picture the country in that last year or two, because the whole of the story is in the picture. The schools closed, the churches locked, the plantations returning to jungle, the boats smashed on the beaches, the clinics empty of the doctors who had fled, the roads cracking, the young carrying clubs in the name of a man most of them had never seen. More than a third of the people gone over the borders or into the ground, and at the dead center of it, in a house in the trees, a man who would not come out, surrounded by suitcases of worthless money and the skulls of the people he had murdered, ruling a kingdom of silence by the light of his nightmares. That is what 11 years had made, but the inward turn, the final paranoia, is also what undid him, because a tyrant who begins killing his own inner circle teaches that inner circle a simple lesson. No, loyalty will save you. In the summer of 1979, Macías ordered the killing of several members of his own family, and that was the miscalculation that ended him. Because among the relatives now afraid for their lives was a nephew, a man who had risen high in the machinery of the regime, who had served it faithfully, who had in fact run its most notorious prison. His name was Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo. He was the warden of Black Beach. He was a senior figure in the country's military, of the same Isangui clan, of the same blood. And one of the family members his uncle had just had killed was, by the accounts, his own brother. Imagine the calculation in that man's mind in those weeks. He had served the regime from the inside. He knew exactly what it did to people, because he had administered it. He had every reason to believe in his uncle's protection, and now his uncle had murdered his brother, and might at any moment come for him. The orphan of Mongomo had spent his whole life turning on the people closest to him, and now, at the very end, he turned on the one-man position to do something about it. The most dangerous enemies, it turned out, were exactly the ones Macías had been right to fear all along, not the intellectuals he had hunted, the family he had trusted. And in the first days of August 1979, the warden of Black Beach made his move. On the 3rd of August 1979, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo led a coup against his uncle. He had support where it mattered, inside the military, and the move was not bloodless. Macías did not simply surrender. He had loyalists, and he had his foreign guards, the men trained and supplied by his Cold War patrons, and there was real fighting in the capital and beyond as the two halves of the regime turned on each other. By the time it was over, something on the order of 400 people are estimated to have been killed in the fighting. The man who had ruled by terror did not fall quietly. He had to be pried loose. Macías fled. He left the capital and ran for the interior, for the forest he knew, toward Mongomo and the border with Cameroon, the same routes by which so many of his people had escaped him. By the accounts that survive, before he ran he made one last gesture that fits everything we know of him. He is said to have tried to destroy what he could of the national treasury rather than leave it to the men overthrowing him, burning what he could not carry, so that even in falling he would take the country's last wealth down with him. Then he disappeared into the trees. The hunt for him lasted about 2 weeks. On the 18th of August, 1979, he was found. The accounts describe him captured exhausted, and at the end of his resources, the president for life, the unique miracle, the man who had made himself a god, run to ground in the forest where he had been born, with nothing left. He was taken into custody by the new government, the government of his own nephew, and brought back to face something his thousands of victims had never been given: a trial. The trial opened in late September of 1979, and to its credit, the new regime did not simply shoot him in a cellar. It convened a military tribunal in public, and it invited international observers to watch, including from the International Commission of Jurists, the respected legal body that monitors exactly this kind of proceeding. The observers who attended would later report that, for all its imperfections, the trial was a real one, the evidence substantial, the guilt established beyond any serious doubt. Macías was charged with the gravest crimes a court can name: genocide, in particular against the Bubi people of the island, mass murder, the systematic violation of human rights, the embezzlement of the country's wealth, treason. For 4 days, the machinery of the regime he had built was laid out in the open, witness after witness and the man who had been its center sat and listened. It is worth marking how unusual that was, and still is. The great tyrants of the 20th century mostly did not end this way. They died in bunkers, or in their beds, or comfortable in exile, or were killed in the street without ever answering a single question under oath. Very few of them were ever made to sit in a courtroom while the evidence of what they had done was read aloud, name by name, by the people who had survived them, whatever its flaws, and a 4-day military trial in a shattered country has many. The proceeding in Malabo was a real attempt to do the hardest thing a wounded society can do, which is to answer horror with law instead of with more horror. To establish, on a record, in front of witnesses from the wider world, that this happened, and that this man did it, and that even he was not above the reach of a court. For the families of the dead it was not justice, because there is no justice that can balance a scale like that one. But it was acknowledgement. After 11 years in which the truth itself had been a crime, the truth was finally spoken out loud, in an official room, and written down where it could not be erased. He was defiant to the end, by the accounts, unrepentant, still insisting on his power, still, perhaps, half believing in the God he had told everyone he was. It did him no good. On the 29th of September, 1979, the tribunal found him guilty and sentenced him to death. By the reports that come down to us, the sentence was pronounced in a form that matched the scale of the crimes, a death sentence handed down many times over, by one account 101 times, one for each of a long list of the dead the court could name. 6 of his closest associates were sentenced to die with him. And then came the strangest detail of an already strange ending, the one that tells you, better than any statistic, what Macías had made of his people's minds. When the time came to carry out the execution, the soldiers of Equatorial Guinea would not do it. They were afraid, not of the politics, not of revenge, but of him, of his power, of the magic he had spent 11 years convincing them he possessed. They genuinely feared that if they shot Francisco Macías Nguema, his spirit would come for them, that the God they had been told he was would not stay dead. And so the new government had to bring in outsiders, soldiers who did not share that fear, a unit of Moroccan troops, to form the firing squad. On the evening of the 29th of September, 1979, in the grounds of Black Beach, the prison he had filled with the dead, the prison his own nephew had once run, Francisco Macías Nguema was shot. He was 55 years old. The regime was over, 11 years almost to the season after the Spanish flag came down, and the hopeful crowds had cheered their first elected president. That president was a body in the prison yard, killed by foreign soldiers because his own people were too frightened of his ghost to do it themselves. The country he had inherited rich and full he was leaving poor and emptied, its schools shut, its churches closed, its people scattered across the borders, a third of them dead or gone. The unique miracle was finished. The only question left was what, if anything, would be built on the ruin he had made. And the answer to that question, as we will see, is its own kind of long shadow. So the tyrant was dead. And here is where you might expect a story like this to lift, at the end, into something like dawn. The monster falls, the nightmare lifts, the country begins, slowly, painfully to heal. I would like to give you that ending. The history will not quite let me, and I have made it a rule, on these long nights, not to tell you anything gentler than the truth. Consider the man who replaced him, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Basogo, the nephew, the man who had run Black Beach Prison, the man who overthrew Macías and put him in front of that Moroccan firing squad, took power on that August day in 1979, and he has never let it go. As I tell you this, more than 40 years later, he is still the ruler of Equatorial Guinea. Sit with the arithmetic of that. Macías ruled for 11 years, and the world called his country the Auschwitz of Africa. The man who ended him has now ruled it for more than 4 decades, longer than Macías did by a factor of nearly 4, one of the very longest-serving leaders anywhere on earth. The warden became the president, and the president stayed and stayed and stayed. The country he rules is no longer poor, at least not on paper, and there is a bitter lesson in how that happened. In the middle of the 1990s, vast reserves of oil were discovered off the coast, and Equatorial Guinea became, almost overnight, one of the largest oil producers in sub-Saharan Africa, pumping hundreds of thousands of barrels a day, its national income soaring into figures that would have been unimaginable in the days of the smashed fishing boats and the rotten Soviet fish. And yet, by the accounts of the international bodies that track such things, the great majority of the population has continued to live in poverty, while the wealth has pooled narrowly at the very top around the ruling family. The same coast that once exported cocoa, and before that launched ships against the slave trade, now pumps oil, and most of the people who live above it have seen very little of what it earns. The flag changed, the face on the wall changed, a great deal else proved harder to change. What remained then is not a clean ending. What remained is a small country on the equator that the world allowed to be nearly destroyed without watching, and that has spent the decades since unable to fully speak of what was done to it, because the machinery of power never entirely changed hands so much as changed owners. The exiles built their lives in Spain and Cameroon and Gabon and farther still, and many never went home. The dead were never fully counted, and never will be, somewhere between a few thousand and the better part of 100,000, a range so wide that it is itself a kind of monument, a measure of how thoroughly the records and the record-keepers were destroyed. The schools and the churches reopened, eventually. The mind of a country grows back slowly. And yet it does grow back, and that is the one thread of light I can honestly hand you at the end of this. The people of Equatorial Guinea were not erased, however hard the attempt. The exiles kept the language and the memory alive in the cities where they landed, and raised children who knew the names their parents had carried out of the dark. Scholars, some of them descendants of the very educated class Macías tried to wipe out, have spent the decades since carefully reconstructing what was done, gathering the figures, writing the histories, refusing to let the footnote close. The Bubi of the island, persecuted as a people, are still there, still themselves. A country that a single man tried to reduce to silence and subsistence is still, stubbornly, a country, with a name and a memory and a story that can be told. He wanted to be the only thing that remained. He is not. The people remained. The memory remained. And that, in the end, is the quiet defeat of every tyrant who ever tried to make himself the whole of a nation. I keep coming back, at the end of this one, to that nickname, and to how few people ever heard it. The Auschwitz of Africa. It was a desperate phrase, reached for by people who had no other words large enough, and it pointed at something real, a whole nation turned into an engine for breaking its own people, in plain sight, in living memory, and almost no one outside that nation knows it happened. That, more than the titles or the slogans, or even the stadium, is the thing I wanted to set right tonight, not to shock you, just to make sure that for one evening, in however many places you are all listening from, this country and these people were not forgotten. So before the night ends, I would genuinely like to hear from you, and you can leave it for me in the comments below, which I do read. Had you ever heard of Equatorial Guinea or of Macías before tonight? Any of it at all? And wherever in the world you happen to be, what made you stay for the whole of a story this dark? I find I learn as much from your answers as you may have learned from the telling. There are other small countries and other forgotten chapters that the larger histories would rather we left in the footnotes, and on another evening, when you are ready, we will go and sit with one of them. For now, I am simply glad you came. Gladder still that this little country had, tonight, at least this one room full of strangers who finally knew its name. Rest well, wherever you are. And the next time you hear someone say that the worst of history is safely behind us, somewhere far away and long ago, remember the little country the size of one small state, and how recently and how quietly it happened.